Welcome to Farmers Inside Track, Food from Mzansi's podcast, and my name is Ivor Price. This episode forms part of a special podcast series brought to you in partnership with Nedbank. Over the coming months, we'll unpack some of the biggest issues shaping agriculture and the business of farming in South Africa. Today we are exploring regenerative agriculture and what the transition looks like in practice. Farmers around the world are under pressure to produce more with fewer resources while navigating rising input costs, climate uncertainty, and growing sustainability demands. Regenerative agriculture is increasingly being viewed not only as an environmental solution, but as a pathway to building more resilient, more productive, and more profitable farming businesses. To help me unpack this, I'm joined by Daneel Rossouw, the Head of Sales for Agriculture at Nedbank. Daneel, thank you for joining us here on Farmers Inside Track. It's always such a pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks, Ivor. Yes, it is a privilege to talk to you today.
So Daneel, let's get into it. What does regenerative agriculture look like in practice, and why are more farmers adopting it these days?
I think to start off with, what was once seen as sustainability conversations is now fast becoming more like a commercial necessity. I'll explain this a bit more. But over the last number of years, we've seen a dramatic increase in climate volatility. I think especially the last 10 years, we've seen droughts, we've seen floods, loss of soil and so forth, even soil degradation, and also biodiversity loss. And with that, we've seen rising input cost, and thus creating more like a new operating environment, in which long-term productivity and also profitability depend on a lot on rebuilding and improving the natural systems that underpin our farming operations itself. So what we're actually talking about is more like a significant shift in the way that we think. In short, I think regenerative agriculture, and we can put conservation agriculture perhaps in the same sentence, is no longer simply about doing less harm, but maintaining and then also building farming systems that's a lot more productive, more resilient, and more efficient, and ultimately more bankable. That's really important for us as financiers, definitely more bankable. But in practice, what are we talking about and what are we focusing on? Firstly, through our farming practices is to look at minimum soil disturbance. And with that, you need to look at the permanent soil cover as well. And obviously, it depends on what system you have and with what do you farm. And especially if you look at the grain industry, then crop diversity and crop rotation becomes a lot more important as well. And with that, also maintaining the living roots in the soil. That's what you want to get as an outcome. And if at all possible, and that's perhaps the difference between conservation agriculture and regenerative agriculture, is to integrate the livestock component strategically into your farming systems. But that's also, depending on your profitability and what works for you on your farm.
I've had the privilege of traveling in the last 2 weeks to different regen farms, one in Prieska in the Northern Cape and Russell's Valley in the Eastern Free State, and it's fascinating to see how farmers are transitioning to regenerative agriculture on different scales. Daneel, from your perspective, what are the biggest challenges farmers face when they are transitioning to regen?
Firstly, it is knowledge. Are you knowledgeable enough in terms of regenerative practices? Sometimes you can jump into what you believe is the right process and, the right practices and, get your homework on what you're supposed to do. But that's just, I think, the first point for me. More important, perhaps, is trying to do too much, too fast. And with that, not having the best finance structure in place. So even before you look at regenerative practices, you need to look at your own efficiencies and your own funding structure. Is it correct? And then you start to look at what is regenerative practices going to cost me. So what you don't want to do is to put undue pressure on your cash flow through this transition period. That's critically important because we know the volatility of the industry in terms of climate change and the impact of climate on our profitability, even with low margins. And for me, that's non-negotiable is you need to protect your cash flow during this period. So looking at the best finance structure, and it differs from business to business. but you need to protect your cash flow as much as you can and have the correct structure in place to limit, I believe, the pressure on short-term funding.
That's pretty solid advice, and some of the biggest critics of regenerative agriculture often say it doesn't make sense business-wise, but as a financier, you've seen the contrary. So maybe Daneel, explain to us, why does regenerative agriculture make sense from a business as well as an investment perspective?
If it comes back, is it a necessity or is it a nice to have? We've seen it over a number of years, and we know that it will increase a lot more in the future. Is that consumer awareness and the impact of consumer demand on how ethically our farming operations are and how ethically we produce our food. So firstly, looking at that consumer awareness as a pull effect, but it can also mean a push effect. And then also the environmental impact that we see of conventional farming methods. It's just not sustainable anymore. So leading perhaps to a preference for sustainable and healthy food options, as I've mentioned, around consumer awareness and consumer demand. But then also important, is the corporate investment. And we as corporates, not only in the banking sector, but throughout the value chain, I believe driving more of these sustainable practices, especially around ESG reporting going forward, and also ensuring sustainability of the sector, throughout the value chain becoming really, really important. So it's not perhaps around does it make business sense, it is what the market will demand of us going forward. So firstly consumers, but then also looking at the environment. So for us, it is critically important to invest in the sector, but then also through our funding, perhaps guiding our farming community as well.
One of my all-time favorite quotes about the importance of soil was from Charles E. Kellogg. He's a soil scientist, well-known American guy. And he said, essentially all life depends upon the soil. There can be no life without soil, no soil without life, and they've evolved together. And I'm hearing you talk about better soil health. How does better soil health improve productivity, profitability, and resilience, Daneel?
Yeah, I think it's interesting if you look back, how we evolved with our farming practices, and we actually thought we did the right thing. But I believe with new technology and, availability of data specifically, I think plays now a much bigger role for the farming community to make better and perhaps more informed decisions as well. So it's interesting how farming evolved over time, but we've seen an exponential increase now towards regenerative practices. But yeah, let's talk about better soil health. Perhaps just one or two things that's important. Healthy soil. Healthy soil improves the resilience of farms to extreme weather events. We've seen it happen in the past, especially around our dryland grain production. I believe, if you look at the Southern Cape and the journey that they've been more than 40 years now, I believe, and they're still learning, but we do see the benefit and the result of having healthy soils, especially during drier periods. The reason I say this, if you look at healthy soils, supporting, and perhaps a bit more technical, but also supporting a wide range of microorganisms, including insects and fungi. And that's quite important, that enhancing our plant health and our ecosystem function. And then really, really important for dryland production, increasing water retention. As you've said, you can't farm without water. Water is life. And we can't control when we get rain, but at least if we can have healthy soils and keep the moisture in our soils, really, really important. We see perhaps a more increase in production in future with these practices, but then also with lower energy cost. So there's definitely on the profitability side, we do see lower energy cost. And really important now is reducing the need for chemical inputs, especially fertilizer. We've seen the increase in fertilizer prices and even the price of diesel now. So just through minimum till or no till, reduce your footprint on soil, but also how many times you go over that soil. It's got a profitability impact. So ultimately being more profitable and sustainable in the process.
So Nedbank is a leading bank, a leading financier, and a great partner to the agriculture sector. But I'm wondering, what kinds of regenerative agriculture investments is Nedbank maybe already financing? I'm not sure if you'd be willing to elaborate on that.
Remember, I believe it is a journey for us as financiers as well, in terms of looking at funding in this space. But I believe currently our biggest investment and what we do fund is in technology, especially equipment. As I've just mentioned, no toll, minimum toll, the latest technology in terms of GPS equipment as well. So it's all around efficiencies too, but we do look at the equipment side. But then also investing in drone technology and data over a number of years now. We've invested in especially one company that's perhaps the leader in drone technology, even international now. But then also focusing on efficiencies around water and renewable energy, but perhaps just around water, moving to more efficient systems, using more with less, and keep that bank in terms of water retention. So that's quite important for us and what we're already focusing on. But then what we're currently working on is around financial solutions for soil health and the measurement thereof. So it's the funding of this whole transition period, but really important going forward for us. And that's part of the journey, I believe, is how do we measure and how do we reward farmers doing the right things, but we need to be able to measure that and quantify it. So that is a journey, but it's a journey that I believe is moving in the right direction very, very quickly.
That's quite fascinating to me because when I think about financing farming, I think most people just see the obvious stuff, the bank finances the tractor, the farm. But now you're already at a level where you're talking about financing better soil health and structuring that. How does that look like? How can financial institutions help farmers manage the costs as well as the risks of the transition?
For us as financiers, there's a big responsibility on us in this whole funding process, because that's what we do. We lend money, but it is within our control to actually direct where we want to lend and to what industries do we want to lend and, what we want to drive. Coming back to regenerative practices. But if we look at conventional agricultural funding, so that's what we did in the past and perhaps, to an extent, still doing. We often prioritize, I believe, immediate output and short-term profitability. So we want to see profit, we want to see a strong balance sheet and so forth. Where the funding of regenerative agriculture is a bit different. It emphasizes the upfront cost. As we've mentioned, it costs money to transition. But then also with that, we see the temporary dips in yield. It can happen. Again, coming back to what I've said, I think earlier, doing too much too fast. And the need for patient capital to support the transition to sustainable practices. So it's all how we structure. But we know the extent and we know the need for upfront investment that needs to be structured over a longer period. And that is for us more business unusual, doing things differently. So with that, we need to acknowledge the long-term value being created over time, because there's a definite value add. And even on the asset side, increasing the value of your asset. So we see that long-term value being created over time and also reward the ecosystem and benefits that we see accruing over time, such as the improved soil health, definitely, and also biodiversity, rather than focusing solely on short-term financial returns. So we need to take a forward-looking view on this and fund accordingly. But finance models then also need to take into account the long-term nature and the benefit of transition, and also ensure that we have minimum pressure on working capital. So you need to keep that liquidity intact in your business. So we need very flexible solutions that work for a specific farmer. So that's what we try to do, to partner with our farmers, to looking at those innovative funding solutions, and it's client-based. It is not an off-the-shelf product. So we look at cash flow management, and in that process, looking at the ideal debt structure. We've seen so many times that farmers funding more long-term capital expenditure products, with short-term capital. And in a drought, it comes back to bite you. So we do have that opportunity to have the correct structure in place with cash flow management. And then we know each situation and I believe farming operation is unique. And I think we're comfortable that we have that flexibility in terms of solutions to cater for every farmer, with their unique requirements.
I'm intrigued about your why. Why is supporting regenerative agriculture important to Nedbank?
Nedbank is green, and we've been supporting sustainability and conservation for a very long time. But I think our support to the industry, and especially regenerative agriculture / conservation agriculture, can be seen as twofold. Firstly, from a food security perspective. It is really important that, that our farmers remain sustainable. We've seen the pressure on margins, see our farming community, we're losing farmers along the way due to very, very tight margins. So especially on the financial side, we've seen that existing farming practices are not sustainable anymore with the pressure on margins. So, for us, it is really important to support and actually to drive these type of practices because we know the value add in terms of long-term sustainability. But then secondly, as a green bank, as I've mentioned, we believe that protection, conservation, and improving the health of our natural resources, so talking specifically to soil and water, is critically important for us. We do have a responsibility as a financier to support and to drive this. We fully understand the pressure on our farming community, and we have a responsibility then to also drive sustainable practices through what I've said earlier, through our lending and where we lend, and then in the process supporting the sector.
Maybe in closing, Daneel, let's talk about the opportunities. What are the opportunities that are on the table for farmers who are brave enough to embrace regenerative practices early?
Yeah, do we talk about regenerative practices or do we talk about survival practices? And saying that, I want to reiterate, regenerative agriculture is becoming a commercial necessity. So we see the impact on climate or even off climate on our farmers, but again, also that consumer demand. So, looking back to the next 5 years, I firmly believe, and we're going into an El Nino now as well, that will definitely put pressure, especially on the dryland production areas. In theory, becoming a lot drier. We came from a few very good years too, but now moving into perhaps a bit more drier few years. I believe that through regenerative practices, farmers will be able to absorb climate volatility a lot better. We've seen that. And they also produce better quality food with lower input cost. That pressure on margins that I've talked about, that remains very relevant. So, we need to look at what the drivers are. Do it only for a nice to have, or do we see the economic reality with this? What I want to leave with the listeners is, it is never too late to start. There's never a correct or a right period to start. It's never too late. But we need to be realistic in terms of the outcome and, what we believe the outcome will be, and then also, what the reality is. And when looking at cash flow management too. If we can get that right, and then embracing the practices and learning from each other, being involved with study groups and congresses, conferences, learn as much as you can. I believe that there's a definite benefit in terms of regenerative practices, and we will see it from an economic perspective as well, and a profitability perspective in the next 5 years.
You've been listening to Farmers Inside Track, Food for Mzansi's podcast in partnership with Nedbank. Many thanks to Daneel Rossouw for helping us unpack why regenerative agriculture is increasingly being viewed as a key part of farming's future. Join us again next time as we continue this special series with Nedbank, exploring the ideas, the innovations, the opportunities shaping South African agriculture. I'm Ivor Price. Thanks for listening.